Welcome back to Beyond the Spot. This is episode 25, Healing in Community versus Individualism, the pathologizing of connection and the return to the circle. I am your host, Tracy Gantlin-Monroy, licensed professional counselor, brain spotting trainer, and support to your healing. You are in the space whereby we decolonize healing one brain at a time. And I am extending this invitation to your nervous system where it meets the sacred and where truth is honored at the speed of safety. Today, we're stepping into a conversation that lives beneath our symptoms, a conversation about belonging, resonance, and the myth that we were not ever meant to heal alone. Because for so many of us, what the world calls pathology is really the body remembering the village it lost. And what we call healing is the long walk back to ourselves and each other. So take a breath with me. Soften your shoulders. And let's explore how community, not individualism, has always been the medicine our nervous systems were designed for. Let's go beyond the spot. And you are absolutely welcomed in this space. Beyond the Spot, Decolonizing, Healing One Brain at a Time, is a podcast that weaves, my first love, of course, brain spotting, and somatic informed modalities with embodied healing, cultural consciousness, and real talk about trauma, resilience, and recovery. Hosted by Tracy Gantlin-Monroy, a licensed professional counselor, spiritual healer, and the first Black female brain spotting trainer in the world. Each episode dares to dismantle mental health myths, uplift lived experiences, and restore collective wisdom. One conversation at a time. Beyond the Spot podcast is for educational purposes and is not therapy. Please reach out to licensed medical and mental health professionals. Thank you. Let's start right here today. I do want to give almost like a cliff notes, but I do want to build a frame around the conversation. I want to start from the place of the macro topic, dealing with pathology as a colonial invention of individualism. Because at some point, we've got to ask ourselves, how did we get here? The fact of the matter is, Western psychology evolved inside a worldview that prioritizes the individual, their mind, their productivity, their pathology. This framing is not neutral, it's political, economic, and highly racialized. Let's break this down a little bit. Let's start right here with the colonial origins of pathology, whereby separation as control. Colonial projects broke kinship systems, land connection, and ritual. The result was isolation. And then isolation was actually called progress. Even when we come from the place of missionary psychology and what that looks like, with the European missionaries, whereby there was an imposition of confession and repentance as moral regulation tools, replacing collective ritual with individual guilt. And what's so interesting of my learning on the Master of Divinity level is how religion in and of itself became the opiate of the people. And I'm borrowing that and I'm turning phrases here, but nonetheless, this is historical. And with the history, you know, if you want to keep secrets from people, real talk, put it in writing. Yeah. And let's talk about the medicalization of difference. Behaviors rooted in survival or spirituality were labeled hysteria, savagery, superstition, or even mental illness. Yeah, think about the drumming and how that has been misconstrued as mania. Or how about this idea of trance being translated and misinterpreted with disinformation as psychosis and even resistance. Yeah, conduct disorder towards antisocial personality. That's actually, we have so many children, especially children of color, especially Black boys, that are stigmatized and labeled as having oppositional defiant behavior or even, excuse me, severe conduct disorder that actually becomes antisocial personality disorder at about 18. Pathology became a taxonomy of colonized behavior, defining health as proximity to whiteness and self containment. There was no, how do you say, acknowledgement of cultural nuances, traditions, or anything of that nature. Everything just had to fit neatly within the colonized perspective. If it did not fit within that scope, then it was absolutely deemed as something is wrong with you and your people. Let's go right here with the industrialization of the South. Capitalism needed an isolated worker, not a communal being. Be clear about that. Individualism became both moral and economic. Stand on your own. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Self made. We've all heard the terms. Therapy oftentimes mirror that economy. Therapy sessions are standard, what, 50 minutes? One client, one expert. Healing has been measured by functionality, not community reintegration. The nervous system, however, does not heal in cubicles. It heals in rhythm, relationship, reciprocity, community. Yeah, be clear. Pathology has served as disconnection. And I'm coming from the Western frame. To be healthy suggests independent, rational, detached. We know from a micro topic perspective, empire, dominant culture normatives, especially in the West, comes from a highly individualistic frame and scope, even when we speak about this idea of disorganized. That simply equals dependent, emotional, relational, whether you want to call it disordered or disorganized. Because for the indigenous system, we as indigenous people are collective. Yeah, we are heterogeneous in the midst of our collectivism, and that's not a problem. Because the fact of the matter is, collectivist, indigenous, and ancestral frameworks are what we require. And from the scope that is known to our systems, which are sacred, healthy serves as connected, attuned, reciprocal. Disordered for us is truly isolated, dishonored, uprooted, unrooted. Western pathology often describes symptoms of disconnection that its own system creates, and it continues to create, oftentimes with anxiety. That has a lot to do with the lack of communal safety. We have people that move through life in survival mode because we know what could happen. There is absolutely a difference between hypervigilance and hypervigilance. Even when we look at this idea of depression, that has so much to do with the loss of meaning and rhythm. And let's look at addiction and let's look at our communities and notice the impact. Could it be that addiction is tied to the absence of ritual and belonging? And how about burnout, which is a normal state for so many of us? Could it be chronic dissonance between values and labor? These are not only mental health issues, these are social injuries and wounds. Somatic prote- protest against hyper-individualism. And when I'm talking about somatic protest, imagine your system being designed in one way and the life that we are told is the way to live counters that. That creates a counter in our system whereby we can notice and feel that something is off, but it's so hard to pinpoint and to put our fingers on it. I want to give you an invitation to the nervous system as a socio-political archive. The body remembers oppression, not as metaphor, but as data. Sympathetic overdrive, constant vigilance in racialized or marginalized bodies. What about this idea of dorsal shutdown? Having to do with generational hopelessness from systemic barriers. And it's pretty timely that I'm inviting this conversation at this particular day and time. What about this idea of fawn response? Learned appeasement to maintain access to safety within hierarchies? When the macro system is dysregulated, the micro body follows suit. And I've been saying for some time that literally right now, 2025, collectively as a nation, our collective nervous system has been in survival mode and dysregulated. It literally feels like there's a gray cloud overcasting the nation. We carry that collectively, one to the other and with one another. And so this becomes an invitation And the idea of decolonizing the diagnostic gaze, y'all, from what's wrong with you towards what happened to us. Collective injury requires collective repair. And none of us can do that by ourselves or alone. As a mental health clinician, we have literally been using the DSM as doctrine. Pathology codes were written within a Eurocentric male heteronormative gaze. That's the dominant cultured normative. For example, oppositional defiant disorder often describes resistance to injustice. Even the idea of adjustment disorder, which happens to oftentimes pathologize change, grief after racism, or even exile. How about this notion of borderline personality, which can describe survival adaptations to chronic invalidation? You know, healing then requires cultural translation, not compliance. And let me say this for the record as a responsible, licensed mental health clinician with over 15 years of experience. Let me be clear as I talk about these phenomenons that exist in our society. This podcast, this conversation in no way negates mental health and the treatment that so many people actually heal. Mental illness is a true thing. And so this is not what this is about, or this is. If you are prescribed medication by your licensed medication prescriber, please take them. This podcast in no way serves as therapy. This is simply a conversation and an invitation to just consider, especially as we sit with clients, as we walk through life carrying our sense of self. I am simply inviting listeners to a consideration because I have encountered this idea whereby mental illness has been spiritualized, whereby people have not been taking care of themselves. There is room and there is place to address mental illness and mental health situations and issues with licensed professional clinicians. I cannot stress that enough. So please don't run with this broadcast and not do your work of investigation. I am simply giving invitation for some considerations that could actually support your journey. This in no way serves as therapy. This does not replace therapy. I am not your therapist. I am simply bringing this idea of how even the idea of the practice of mental health in the West, how it has been commodified, how it has been presented so often through a colonized lens that does not make room for culture and traditions, that does not often acknowledge the sacred nature of our nervous system and how so many of the symptoms that we notice has much to do with the idea of being cut off from the root of the authenticity of ourselves. I think that there is room for all of it. I think there is space for Western medicine and Indigenous and cultural knowing. Okay? Because the fact of the matter is, we all have intrinsic knowing that is inherent ancestrally, generationally, intergenerationally, that oftentimes does not receive any credence, any acknowledgement. Because Indigenous people have made it historically through the years, okay? Before there was Western psychology, there were people upon the earth. We understood the nature of communal. We understood the sacredness of circles. We understood the necessity for a relationship. And so, with that, I am coming from the space of reclaiming community as clinical intervention because community care isn't an alternative to therapy. It is a part of therapy returned home, co regulation as nervous system economics. Energy shared lowers the cost of survival when we carry it together. Circles, feast, vigils as the original group sessions, mutual aid as trauma informed care, tangible safety before emotional exploitation. Western models oftentimes treat belonging as optional support. I am demanded, I am demanding that there ain't nothing optional about the idea of belonging. Optional is not even a part of the purview when we talk about support. Indigenous and ancestral models recognize belonging as biological necessity. And so, with that, all I'm suggesting, all I'm saying here is we are identifying the false promise. Oftentimes, Western psychology sold us independence as healing. I'm naming the cost, okay? Because that independence severed us from the regulation that keeps us alive. And so, with that, this week, we are revealing the lineage coming from an indigenous, African, and diasporic traditions, which always understood this, that healing was a circle, not a couch. Now, I'm not knocking the couch. I'm not knocking what we do as licensed mental health clinicians. I think it's and both. It's not either or, just like there are those mental health conditions that also require medication therapy. I promote that because my deal is why struggle when there is support available? When we hear a diagnosis, when we hear a phenomenon, when we hear that we need support in our body, that can be scary. And one of the things that we tend to overlook is when it comes to our mental health. So I'm not ever going to tell you not to do what you need to do to take care of yourself because some people literally need serotonin re-uplift inhibitors to support the flow of serotonin in their system. Depression has a lot to do with the neurochemicals being unbalanced. I am going to suggest support for anxiety. I am going to suggest medication support, oftentimes for psychosis, psychotic phenomenons. I am. Because there are people that really need that support. My goal is to reframe the pathology. Maybe what we call disorders, maybe they are phenomenons. Maybe it is our nervous systems mourning the loss of community. I know that's a part of it, but I'm also keen enough and aware enough to know that's not the full story. My goal is to support community and offer restoration, to heal, to restore. We got to return to the circle, not as nostalgia, but as neuroscience. That's what this is about. Okay? So I just want to be clear about my offering and my intentions here, because this is serious business, especially as we're experiencing a collective, a communal, a societal dysregulation, because we carry that regulation or dysregulation together in community. Okay? Because here's the reality: before there was therapy, there was community. Before there were treatment plans, there were circles. Uh huh. Before there were credentials, there was belonging. Way before there were symptoms, there were songs, voices in rhythm with firelight and heartbeat. Before the DSM, there was discernment. And we didn't heal alone, y'all. We healed around fire, around drums, around story. Healing was circular, never in solitary. I'm just saying. But somewhere between empire and industry, the circle was broken. And the West oftentimes named our grief pathology. Between colonization and capitalism, healing became lonely. It got really lonely. And the body began to whisper, this isn't how it's supposed to be. We live in a world that calls disconnection normal. We literally celebrate independence even when it costs us intimacy. We praise productivity while our nervous systems mourn belonging. I can't tell you how many clients come in from A to Z, and at the root, there's this idea of comparison and belonging. Western psychology took the sacred circle and drew a box around it. Yeah, and oftentimes we call that an office. One of the beautiful things I love about brain spotting is the transportability. The transportability. I have literally spotted a total stranger on a catamaran in Mexico. Let's not talk about the young man of Colombian descent that I met while in Mexico and invited him to the veranda at my room, and we used the brewing storm as acoustics for our session. I literally carry a pointer in my purse. Sure do. You would be hard pressed to catch me without a pointer. In brain spotting, we use a pointer to harness the gaze. Okay. And so, with that, brain spotting is my go to for so many reasons, and somatic therapies, because the body truly does keep the score. And our nervous system is almost like that B roll that they talk about in production. And, you know, we got some stuff in our nervous system that we don't even recognize until it presents itself. And so, with that, there's no way to measure solely by what we have created from this idea of, what do they call it? Market trends, profession, okay? And so many times we've named solitude as self care. This is just an invitation to take a different look at it, a more inclusive look. But the fact of the matter is that healing was never meant to happen in isolation. Oftentimes, we experience trauma in community, we are wounded in community, we experience hurt in community. And at the same token, healing also happens in community. We call that collective healing, right? Because the nervous system was designed for resonance, to be felt, mirrored, witnessed. That's not weakness, that's wiring. We are diagnosing disconnection way too long, way too much. We are prescribing to the body what the culture broke. Just want to invite you to take a breath and to feel your feet on the ground. Now imagine your ancestors breathing with you. All those who healed without credentials, without insurance, without permission. Because, like it or not, we still have a lot of people who do not have access to formal therapy, and mental health has been stigmatized and stereotyped, especially in communities of color. This period of time is probably the most mainstream mental health has ever been in the history of psychology, Western psychotherapy, and all the things. And so when I say that, I am simply inviting you to know that lineage is also regulation. That's community medicine moving through your blood. And it has kept our ancestors. Okay? Pathology, in and of itself, was born in the same era that birthed empire. Colonizers dismantled communal rituals and labeled Indigenous and African practices as primitive and replaced them with control, confession, and compliance. Drumming became mania, trance became psychosis, resistance became defiance, and the collective was broken into individuals, each made to carry what once was held together and carried together. And they called that civilization. But what it really was separation. Healing practices that belonged to the village, the talking circle, the sweat lodge, the ring shout, the grief drum, the feast, were stolen, sterilized, and resold, oftentimes as treatment. I hear and see and experience and witness. I can't tell you how many ruptures there were to be in persons of color spaces learning much of the modalities that I'm trained in, and there would be an eruption of people all over the spaces declaring, this is cultural appropriation. This was taken from this people, that people, the people, the pa 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 pa. Y'all know what I'm talking about because many of you all were in those same trainings, workshops, seminars, schools with me. Colonization didn't just steal land, it stole context, it stole medicine. It took communal healing and made it clinical. And some of the challenges for me is sometimes I feel like what they took it in clinical enough to be open enough to be more inclusive. Okay, it took spirituality and made it superstition. Personally, I believe that the brain and the body does the work of healing anchored into your source. Whether that source is your spirituality, your tradition, your culture, your source is absolutely wherever you find strength. It literally took rhythm and made it riot. Those talking drums, y'all know what I'm talking about. The trance. For anyone who's ever experienced this idea of leaving yourself and going to a higher place within self, within spirit, you know what I'm talking about. The reality is there has become an industrialization of the self. Because then came industry, machines, profit, labor, the myth of the self made person. Healing has become privatized. We see what's happening with insurance rates and, you know, listen, I don't get into politics, but listen, you would have to be under a rock not to notice what's happening amongst us right now. Healing was privatized and it continues to leave so many people unaccounted for. Wholeness became work. In that system, sometimes therapy has mirrored the factory. One worker, one output, one measurable result. We began diagnosing what the system produced: exhaustion, alienation, anxiety, depression. And we call it disorders. I like to reference them as phenomenons. But sometimes at the root can be this grossly negligent ideological construct of disconnection, y'all. Because here's the truth. Sometimes what we name pathology can be the body's grief over the loss of community. Yeah, because with anxiety, could it be the absence of co regulation? Even depression, the collapse of meaning, addiction, the ache of unshared ritual, burnout, the cost of self over system? Are these moral failings or personality flaws? Real talk? I don't think they're either. These are not moral failings. Failings. They're not personality flaws. I think it could be a nervous system protest against the lie of isolation and all the pathology, quite frankly. And it's very fascinating to me, and I'm so happy that myself and my colleagues are moving more towards the indigenous with our practices, that we're having a reclamation, that we're noticing the impact of what that looks like as we're working with people. You know, the fact of the matter is, there are ancestral maps of collective healing long before this profession. And yeah, Indigenous people were around before the grandfather of psychology or even the DSM. Cultures across the globe already understood the science of belonging. Another thing I love about brain spotting, because it becomes the East meeting the West. And in these days and times, we have got to have tools in our toolboxes that are effective. You know, in West Africa, drumming aligned with heartbeats brought us into harmony. You know, among the Lakota and the Anishinaabe. The talking circle restored order through witness. Even in the Polynesian islands, the kava ceremony slowed the breath and opened truth. In the Black church, the ring shout transmuted trauma into transcendence. These were not performances, and I got a problem with cultural appropriation. Leave people's stuff alone when you don't understand what it is. Yeah. Leave Indigenous folk stuff alone that has been grossly and negligently commodified and appropriated. Stop. That sacred stuff. We're not performing, people. These are and were physiological regulation, healing encoded in rhythm, relationship, and with reverence, communal coherence, centuries before these westernized terms existed. So when we talk about the nervous system, we are speaking a language our ancestors already knew. They lived in resonance. They prayed through vibration. They grieved as one body. And the fact of the matter is, it's time for a clinical reckoning. Yes. You know what? I don't know where I would be had I not discovered, happed upon, was not directed towards brain spotting and then somatic experiencing and then IFS and all the things. Clinicians, healers, therapists. This part is for us when I talk about the clinical reckoning. We were trained inside a paradigm that separates healer and client, body and mind, science and spirit. We call people resistant when their lineage refuses our colonial script. We label dependent what is actually relational intelligence. We treat collective trauma with individual interventions and wonder why it won't resolve. It can't transcend. But liberation psychology, somatic abolitionism, and brain spotting invite us back to wholeness, not by abandoning science. I cannot stress that enough. There was science before we could even describe or explain the phenomenon. Stop. Science is an attempt to explain and justify what exists. Okay? Okay? This is not about abandoning science, but this is about remembering the sacred that it was built upon. When I facilitate brain spotting trainings, when I facilitate brain spotting intensives, when I facilitate groups, when I facilitate brain spotting in any form, even in my retreats, I use brain spotting as well. I watch what happens when bodies remember each other. Safety spreads, breath synchronizes. I can't tell you how many times I've worked with a client, even one on one, and by the end of the brain spotting encounter, our breathing was synchronized. I've literally felt a magnet between me and clients, okay? The room hums with unspoken grace. That's not magic. It's memory. It's sacred. And this is what I mean when I say we heal at the speed of safety. Because safety is not a solo act. None of us is a one note symphony. It's relational, it's ancestral, it's communal. I can't tell you how many times, even in brain spotting trainings, we do the didactic teaching, we do the neuro experiential demonstrations with the participant at the training. I can't tell you how often literal collective healing occurs. Just this past weekend, there was a man who was bold, and he was simply amazing. And he was the demo. A young woman came up during the debrief and she witnessed, I received the healing. You just stood in the gap for my father. His story and your story was so similar that I received the healing. That's not uncommon when it comes to communal healing, you all. We co create space when we're with others, okay? And so my invitation has everything to do with the return to the circle. The revolution is not in new theories. It's in ancient remembering. Healing is returning to the circle, returning to community, to shared meals, shared songs, shared witness, to reciprocity as medicine, understanding it is sacred. You can't heal a collective wound with an individual prescription. You can't meditate a culture of isolation, but you can rebuild belonging. One conversation, one circle, one nervous system at a time. This is how we unlearn pathology and reclaim connection. This is how we restore community as clinical intervention. This is how we return home. If you are tired of holding it all alone, you are not broken. You are just lonely in a system that forgot how to hold you. Healing in community isn't dependency. It's divine design. It's how the Creator wired the human heart to beat in time with another. So, may we stop pathologizing what is sacred. May we remember that belonging is biology, it's neurobiology. And may we find each other again in the sound of safety. Thank you for spending this time with me. I am Tracy Gantlin-Monroy, and this is Beyond the Spot, Decolonizing Healing One Brain at a Time. Until next time, breathe with your people and remember, we heal at the speed of safety. I will be dropping a bonus to episode 25, and I'm going to share with you some reflective invitations having to do with healing in community versus individualism, the pathologizing of connection. And so that bonus will be attached to this segment. Thank you. I appreciate our time together and I look forward to this offering. Have a wonderful day as we all heal communally together. If today's episode resonated with your nervous system or your spirit, share it with someone who's still unlearning and reach out to me. My website is gracecommunitycounseling.com. You can reach me on Instagram at Monroy LPC. That is MONROY LPC. Also, I have offerings from retreats to brainspotting trainings to workshops, you name it. And I am also a speaker. So if you ever need a speaker with my skill set, look me up. Give me a call. Let's see what can happen. And absolutely for you clinicians and adjacent body healers, feel free to reach out and attend a brain spotting training. We have trainings all the time. Thank you.